You are now live.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this discussion about consumer fraud concerns during the pandemic and steps that law enforcement are taking to address them. I'm Andrea Terry, the Director of Learning for the Maryland State Bar Association, and I'd like to thank our team of presenters today from the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland. Assistant U.S. Attorney Evelyn Cusson is our program chair, and she's assembled a terrific panel, including her colleagues, Assistant U.S. Attorneys Aaron Zielinski and Sean Delaney, to lead this morning's presentation and discussion. If you have questions during the session, please email them to chriselle@msba.org, the email address that you see at the bottom of your screen, and your faculty will do their best to get the answers out to you, as many of them as they can during this session. We're scheduled to go to 10:30 to accommodate as many questions as possible. So again, thank you for joining us. And at this point, I'll turn the program over to Evelyn.
Good morning. My name is Evelyn Cusson. I'm an Assistant United States Attorney in the Civil Division at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland. I'm also the Elder Justice Coordinator in the office.
Sean, you're muted.
Well, take two. Hey, I'm Sean Delaney. I'm a Assistant United States Attorney. I'm the Deputy Chief of the Fraud and Public Corruption Section in the District of Maryland. I'm also the co-chair of the office's COVID-19 fraud initiative, as well as the price gouging and hoarding task force. Thank you very much for having us today.
I'm Aaron Zielinski. I'm an AUSA in the white collar section as well. I'm also the co-coordinator of the task force related to COVID-19 and on the price gouging and hoarding task force as well.
Next slide. We wanted to take a moment at the start of our discussion today to talk about the purpose of this presentation. Obviously, at this time, we know we must protect ourselves by following the advice of healthcare professionals. As we hope to make clear today, while we continue to safeguard our physical health by washing our hands, by practicing social distancing, we must also protect ourselves from financial exploitation, from those who seek to use this pandemic for their own personal gain. And as attorneys, you are uniquely situated in the community. And so our goal is for you to take the information that you learn during this presentation today and to use it to counsel your clients so that they can identify scams and frauds, and so that they know where to report when, unfortunately, these things happen.
Look, as many of you know, fraudsters are creative. They'll look for any opportunity to get access to your wallet, to your personal information. And the COVID-19 pandemic has created an environment not only of fear and uncertainty, but also of isolation of people from their family, from their friends, and their social structure. That is particularly fertile ground for fraud.
So the presentation today is going to provide an overview of the types of scams that law enforcement is seeing and beginning to encounter in the midst of the COVID-19 epidemic, and some ways that you can counsel your clients to avoid those scams. We'll also explain some law enforcement tools that are available and where to report someone if you know that someone, either yourself or someone that you know, has been targeted by one of those scams. If anyone has any questions during the presentation, you can email those questions to CRISELLE@msba.org, or you can submit them directly in the YouTube chat window. We're going to do our best to respond to those questions in the course of the presentation and incorporate our responses, but in the event we don't, we'll certainly have time at the end for those questions as well.
Go to the next slide. So investigating and prosecuting COVID-19 fraud schemes is a priority for the Department of Justice nationwide, as well as our office. Though we're practicing social distancing, obviously, and taking steps to protect ourselves, our office is still open for business at this point in time. Along with our investigating partners, the FBI, the IRS, basically every investigating agency at this point in time, we will continue to vigorously pursue leads and find any people who are attempting to profit from this pandemic through criminal activities.
The Department of Justice has directed each United States Attorney's office to appoint a COVID fraud coordinator, as well as a member of the department's price gouging and hoarding task force. Sean and I are working together to serve in both of those roles. In this capacity, we're working with our law enforcement partners that Sean mentioned earlier to protect the public from scammers who are exploiting the fears that are surrounding COVID-19.
It's important to know that many of these scams target particularly vulnerable populations, which includes the elderly. And as we know from our experience, the elderly can be particularly susceptible to these types of frauds. And this pandemic, as Sean mentioned, has created more opportunities for fraudsters because people are separated right now from their social network, their family, their connections. And so they may be more inclined to fall for a fraud scheme or for a scam. And they may have less opportunity to use their family and friends and social connections as a sounding board for whether or not they're being scammed. So this is just a particularly rife time for people and for your clients.
So we can move to the next slide. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland has set up an email address that you'll see there on the screen for the purpose of referring potential scams and crimes to us for future investigation. And many of our federal partners, essentially all of them, from the FBI to the Internal Revenue Service, the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Health and Human Services, have assigned dedicated agents for the purpose of rooting out this fraud. Sean and myself are engaged in sifting through the complaints that are coming in nationwide. Many of those do touch on Maryland, and we are seeking to take appropriate action as quickly as possible.
And again, touching on the international nature of a lot of the complaints, for complaints that touch on things more than just the District of Maryland, we'd refer you to the National Center for Disaster Fraud, the number there in the center of the screen, or the email address. The folks there are doing a stellar job of collecting tips and referrals, and every night I get another list of all of the nationwide referrals that go through that center, and that includes the ones from Maryland. So that is another excellent resource for those curious of where to refer frauds when they see them, in addition to our email address.
And finally, you can refer complaints of any type of financial fraud targeting seniors to the National Elder Fraud Hotline. The hotline is staffed by case managers who can provide information to callers and also referrals to different agencies. When applicable, those case managers will complete a complaint to the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center or a consumer complaint to the Federal Trade Commission on the caller's behalf. That number is 833-FRAUD-11, again 833-372-8311.
Now we're going to talk for a few minutes about some of the types of frauds that have been publicly reported at this point in time. Some of these schemes have been taken down while others are emerging, and some of the schemes you hear about, there may be current schemes ongoing that attack this in a similar manner. It's our office's mission to take decisive action to thwart fraudsters who are preying on people at this very difficult time. That's why it's important for practitioners like you to be able to recognize these frauds when you see them and refer them to authorities. The sooner we become aware of a fraud, the sooner we can take action. Even if that means that we won't have sufficient evidence to bring a criminal case, we can still take action now to protect the public, and we intend to do so. We can click to the next slide. So viewers who have extensive criminal experience will likely have a similar reaction to this that we did. Which is the majority of the frauds that we're seeing now are not really new frauds. They're the same tried and true fraud schemes that fraudsters have been using for years and years. They're just beginning to incorporate COVID-19 into their frauds.
For example, if you look at on the screen, we're seeing a number of schemes similar to what we have seen and what we are used to prosecuting. Computer-based fraud, so think phishing scams. Those are attempts by criminals to get a hold of personal identifying information, passwords, anything else by sending emails to targets and trying to get their victims to either click a link or provide information to them directly. Fraudulent websites that can contain malware that can seek to harvest information. We'll go over one of those in a little more detail in a moment. And fraudulent applications that do the same thing, but seeking to obtain that through a phone or a tablet. The goals, largely speaking, of these fraud activities are getting a hold of personal identifying information, think social security numbers, credit card numbers, health account information, banking information, anything else that could allow someone to get a hold of passwords associated with computer systems so that they can steal either the identity or liquidate accounts from the victims. They also appear to be looking for health-related information. That is, if someone, for example, could get a Medicare number, they can bill for items that are not necessarily being delivered, and we'll talk about that a little more extensively. If we could move to the next slide, and we'll go over in a little more detail one of these schemes. So this is a recent example of a computer fraud that, while not new, is being tailored to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a picture of the Johns Hopkins website that many of you may be familiar with that tracks COVID-19 deaths and cases worldwide. There's now been widespread media reporting that at the end of March, individuals within Russian language forums were selling a product that mimicked this application, but had a malware application associated with it. Basically, the program loaded a function just like the Johns Hopkins map, but it would infect the user's computer and the friends of the user with malware that could then steal passwords and return them to the perpetrator.
And beyond this map and this particular scheme, there was a report just last week in Politico that cyber criminals have created another app that promises to detect contact with infected persons, people who are infected with COVID-19. And then rather than provide this function, once it was downloaded on a person's phone, the app essentially froze that person's phone and then demanded a Bitcoin ransom. It doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to imagine a person already isolated from their friends and family in their house who attempts to download this software to protect themselves, only to become further isolated as their phone, their source of information and their source of contact with friends and family, has now been locked out from them. We can go ahead and move to the next slide now. One of the other things we're seeing a lot of now is the sale of misbranded or fake vaccines and cures. This headline is of a case that some of you may have heard about, a 53-year-old man from California arrested after he was selling prevention pills and a fake injectable cure for COVID-19 on Instagram. The reports are that the videos containing these false claims had been viewed upwards of 2 million times by the time he was arrested. And he was arrested by complaint in federal district court in Los Angeles and charged with wire fraud after he made claims to an undercover agent, including that the $300,000 investment with him could yield $30 million in profit.
It's important to note here that the CDC has made clear that there is no vaccination as of yet to prevent COVID-19 and no magic cure once a person contracts it. But scammers and fraudsters are feeding on people's fears surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. And certainly it's not new that there are people out there who will try to sell consumers magic potions or elixirs to try to prevent or treat disease. But now we're seeing new iterations of that, again, preying on people's fears. And it's very important that you and your clients are vigilant in spotting these issues. And we'll go over the up-to-date sources of information through CDC and other sources where people can have that information about what is available in terms of treatment.
And just following up on what Evelyn said, we want to particularly stress that while viewers of this program may well be sufficiently sophisticated that you can protect yourselves from these frauds, we are particularly working with you and others to make sure that your clients are on notice and protected as well. The easiest way to avoid these frauds taking place is to harden the target, to get information out so that people are savvier consumers of information. And even though some of these frauds may seem relatively minor, a Craigslist or Facebook post, an email or a phone message from a relatively unsophisticated fraudster, it's important to note and report these crimes. If someone's selling a vaccine or a cure right now, they're a dangerous threat to the public. They need to be addressed and investigated and shut down. And even relatively unsophisticated frauds, as we see all too often, can have the capacity to cause great harm to a person, either because that person loses money or they have developed some mistaken belief that they are immune from COVID-19 and put themselves and others at greater risk than they were before.
We have a question here that I think we may be able to answer. It says, there are a number of places to send complaints about scams, fraud, and I attended a session yesterday from the Federal Trade Commission that discussed some of these and mentioned that some state AG's offices share information with their agency. Do the various federal and state agencies, civil and criminal, share information about complaints? And can you give us some tips as to where to best direct complaints?
So I'll go ahead and jump on that one. The state AG's office has been an excellent partner with us in these early weeks of the pandemic. We have maintained contact with the Maryland State AG's office, and they in fact have been giving us reports that they've been receiving of complaints so that we can both look into them. Also, the state AG's office, it's my understanding at this point in time, they've sent out over 100 different notifications to people engaged in potential price gouging. So I know for a fact that the state AG's is on this, and we are also attempting to do all we can to communicate with them and share whatever information we can. And most importantly, given that it's we're essentially just getting started in all the work we have to do in investigating and prosecuting this fraud, we intend to remain in contact with them. So I think you should refer things to both us and to the state AGs, but rest assured we will make sure we remain in contact with them.
And just to jump on quickly to emphasize what Sean said, the FTC, we are also getting the information in from the FTC system as well. As I said, we've set up our own system. I would recommend that you should go to the individual in the first instance or the agency that best fits the type of complaint. So if what you have is a fake vaccine, a fake cure, misbranding in any way, any of those individuals, I think, could take them and deal with it. Obviously, at the federal level, we've said we're pursuing any case, no matter the size, and we're working with our state and local partners. Those are all good places to put a complaint. And if you have any questions at all, you can always reach out to us about a particular complaint through that email address. But we can take incoming from any of those, and we're all working carefully and exchanging information.
I think we can go ahead and move to the next slide. Another type of fraud that has been rearing its ugly head are fake COVID-19 testing sites. Now, these are pictures borrowed from a news report in WAVE3 in Louisville, Kentucky, that I think have also been widely reported. The folks here set up what was dubbed a testing site, a church parking lot in Kentucky. And as you can see, the alleged practitioners were in full medical gear. They appeared to be nurses. Victims would pay $40 in order to drive up and meet with one of these folks, who would then hold up a phone to video chat with a supposed doctor, who would then decide if the victim was able to pay $200 to get tested for COVID-19. The victim would then drive up to another similar site that looked like this in the same parking lot and would have his or her throat swabbed. Unfortunately, this test was fake. In the United States Attorney's Office and the FBI in the Western District of Kentucky conducted surveillance, undercover transactions, and worked with the state AG in Kentucky to obtain a temporary restraining order. However, as the federal law enforcement folks approached this site, the people running the site packed up their gear and hopped in rented cars and left. This really is just one example of just how far people will go to perpetrate a fraud and make their fraud look legitimate.
And beyond taking cash payments from people in this case, the fake tests could also have been used for an additional reason, as we alluded to earlier, and that's searching for victims' insurance information. While COVID-19 tests themselves reimburse to providers at a relatively low rate, once a victim's insurance information is in the possession of a fraudster, it can be used to bill for lots of tests or fraudulent goods and services that are never actually conducted. And so we're actively on the lookout for this type of insurance fraud as well, but it requires people to be aware of to whom they're sharing their health information and to be alert to what is going on.
And this is especially true now, given that the rules have been relaxed to allow a greater use of telemedicine, which of course is very important to allow people to get medical attention while maintaining safe social distancing, but it also presents a potential for fraud as people become more comfortable with providing their health information and other personal information over the telephone. So in that vein, we'd also encourage you to counsel your clients to not provide their Medicare number over the phone, because scammers want to use that Medicare number to charge the government, again, for unnecessary tests and medical equipment that's also not necessary. We can go to the next slide.
So, these are more of these, what we would call traditional telemarketing, internet and in-person frauds that have been modified to have a COVID-19 gloss. And we expect that these will continue to increase, particularly as the checks start going out and government and support payments and the stimulus bill begins to kick into place. So things to watch out for are, fake stimulus or government support payments, websites telling your clients that they may be able to get money that is not associated with the federal or state government, fraudulent charitable organizations or people claiming to be in need that are in fact perpetrating scams. There are obviously many worthy and worthwhile charitable organizations that can use our help in these difficult times, but you want to be sure to carefully vet where the information is, where the money is going. And then, as Sean discussed earlier, fraudulent investment scams promising large returns for COVID-related fake cures. And as we said earlier, the easiest way to prevent these is remain vigilant. So if there's anything we could emphasize, it's trying to make sure that your clients know to be careful and cautious about what they're doing. We go to the next slide.
And specifically with respect to the investors type scams, the SEC has a tool at investor.gov to look up whether a person or a business is actually registered with the SEC to provide investment advice and to sell investments. So that's another good way to fact check whether this person is really authorized to be selling securities. That's, again, investor.gov. So the slide we're on now is borrowed from the Federal Trade Commission's website. It has very helpful information, tips that people can use to avoid COVID-19 scams. For the most part, these tips are useful to avoid any type of fraud or scam beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. So they are Ignore offers for vaccinations and home test kits. Hang up on robocalls. And importantly, when you're called, do not press a button to be removed from a list. In some cases, you actually may be added to a list for these types of fraudulent robocalls. So simply hang up. Watch out for phishing emails and text messages. Don't click in emails or texts that you didn't expect or that you don't know the sender. As Aaron mentioned, research before you donate. Don't give your hard-earned money to a charity that you haven't vetted. And the same is true for investments. And so you can stay in the know and get information from ftc.gov/coronavirus. And we wanted to note here too that there are fraudulent websites that masquerade as official websites or as government websites. But it's important to note that only those websites with a .gov in the address are actually official government websites. And in a related vein, we've seen this well before COVID-19. Scammers may try to impersonate government officials, such as the IRS or the Social Security Administration. We saw those imposter type scams. So if a government official calls on the phone, research that number, take down that number and call it back to make sure that that's really this official calling. There are very few instances in which a government official would call and request personal information over the phone.
Now, I think for the most part, and this is a little bit what Aaron alluded to before, we understand that you practitioners are all sophisticated and you're likely to spot these scams yourself. But we are most interested that you are reporting it to your clients and keeping your clients aware. And the fact of the matter is, we do this for a living. And, you know, our victims always say similar things, which is, I was so stupid. I can't believe I didn't see this. I should have known better. These are common things that people say because people fail to realize that scammers are very good at what they do. They do this for a living. This is their job. And they develop sophisticated scams. And all the advice you're looking at on the page here is incredibly useful now. It was incredibly useful 2 months ago as well. This isn't new information. These are the ways that, unfortunately, in the world we live in with technology, computers, and telephones, we need to be vigilant and we need to pay attention to who we're talking to and what information we're sharing with them. I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So hoarding and price gouging. Recently, the president issued an executive order pursuant to the Defense Production Act, which prohibits hoarding of designated items. And the order allowed the Department of Health and Human Services to designate items as protected. Once an item is designated, the statute makes clear that it is a crime for a person to accumulate that item either, 1, in excess of reasonable need, or 2, for the purpose of selling it in excess of market prices. As you can see on the screen, the Attorney General designated or established the Hoarding and Price Gouging Task Force. This is in addition to the COVID Fraud Initiative Group, and Aaron and I are working together on hoarding and price gouging as well. We are members of the task force for the District of Maryland. There has been a long list of items that have been designated under the Act. They include things like N95 masks with filtering respirators, ventilators, medical gowns, PPE, and I think you'd note that it's not just the N95 masks, not just the ventilators, but this act really covers right down to the nitty-gritty the types of gloves and gowns and things and face masks that our medical professionals are using and need to keep us safe. Violations of this statute are punishable by up to a year in jail and a fine of $10,000. And in addition to price gouging, I think folks should know that the department is working to identify stockpiles of PPE so that we can get access to it and make it available to medical professionals in the country. You can probably clip to the next slide now, I think.
Yes, please. So this is another example taken from press reporting and the work the task force is doing. This is a Brooklyn man who was arrested for hoarding and price gouging of critical medical supplies. He is suspected of selling about 1,000 masks to a New Jersey doctor at $12,000. That's about a 700% markup on the mask. So FBI agents were able to find empty boxes of N95 masks, pallets of masks that had been delivered. He was arrested ultimately, and the materials were seized. According to news reports, the stockpiles of supplies are going to go to medical workers in New York and New Jersey.
We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So, as we alluded to earlier, a lot of the criminal tools that we're using to prosecute these crimes, much like the crimes themselves, aren't really new. They're just crimes done with a COVID twist, essentially. So you'll see at their heart, these crimes are still schemes to defraud. And if the scheme to defraud involves a mailing, we can use the mail fraud prosecution or the mail fraud statute to prosecute it. If it's fraud involving wires, we can prosecute it using wire fraud. If it's healthcare fraud, if you're stealing people's billing information and using that to bill for services that weren't provided, we can use our traditional healthcare fraud statutes as well as identity fraud statutes, where you'll find, and we expect to see this more over the weeks ahead, where people are stealing the identities of folks, either through business email compromises or through theft of mail. If they get folks' identities, then we would expect them to falsely apply for government benefits that will be coming out, stimulus benefits, unemployment benefits. And in the event we can find and identify that, we'd intend to prosecute those folks using 18 U.S.C. 1028A, which is aggravated identity theft. Traditionally, you've seen prosecutions in fraud connected with major disasters, which is 18 U.S.C. Section 1040. And I think Aaron is going to talk on the next slide about some statutes that may be emerging statutes that you'd hear about over the next weeks and months as well. So I think we can move to that slide.
So with the invocation of the Defense Production Act, there are some additional statutes that we've been discussing that are available, including 50 United States Code, Section 45, 12, and 13. Those have to do with hoarding and price gouging, the cases that we just discussed earlier. We also anticipate that we will see more prosecutions brought under the sale of fake drugs and cures. That can be charged in multiple ways. One could be under Title 15. The other can be under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Title 21, for selling misbranded or adulterated items. And then there's also violations of the Consumer Product Safety Act, which is 15 U.S.C. 2068. These are less commonly used in the past, but given the invocation of the Defense Production Act in the case of the hoarding and price gouging statutes and what we are beginning to see in terms of fake cures, we anticipate that we may make more use of these statutes in the future. And there are complementary state statutes, as there often are for criminal cases, to our federal statutes. Maryland has its own anti-gouging statute. It's located at chapters 13 and 14. The governor has issued an executive order, and those prohibit the raising of prices on many consumer goods and services that increase the seller's profit by more than 10% while we're in a declared emergency. As Sean said earlier, our partners in the Maryland Attorney General's office with whom we are working have sent over 100 warning letters to entities that are engaged in alleged price gouging. We can move to the next slide.
We have a question here before we get into civil actions. The question is the U.S. Attorney's Office working with anyone in the Inspector General established as part of the CARES Act? Does the Inspector General's office have independent authority to investigate and bring enforcement actions? Sean, Aaron, I'm not sure if you've had any experience with that.
Aaron, do you have anything to say, or you want me to jump in?
So at this point in time, we're working with all of our available federal partners. Those include individuals from across all the agencies that we addressed earlier, and we certainly will listen to and receive complaints from any avenue which we have available. Sean, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can say that we are actively working in our office to set up a framework. And the IG, if I understand the question, I think the IG, we're getting a little bit towards what you may see as the second wave of fraud, beyond just taking advantage of consumers at this point in time and defrauding regular citizens. There's also widely thought to be a second wave of fraud. That would be those defrauding the government of stimulus payments or other unemployment fraud payments. And I can tell you that there are active conversations in our office about how we set up the proper framework to make sure we are prepared for that. And I know the Attorney General's office in Maryland is paying attention to that as well. If that means coordinating with the IGs, we'll be coordinating with the IGs. I know I can already tell you that I've personally had conversations with representatives from a number of different agencies about that very issue. And we intend to be active and present in making sure that fraud is unsuccessful.
Okay. So at this point, we also wanted to mention civil actions that may be of use in this arena.
So just before we had one more question too from Stuart Berman that I think we can just respond to quickly. And the question was whether we've been hampered by not having grand juries sitting, and if we don't have the ability to indict within 30 days of arrest as required by the Speedy Trial Act, and we don't have return dates for grand jury subpoenas, what steps can you take to ensure fraudsters are successfully prosecuted, not just temporarily disrupted? So to answer that question, Stuart, the first thing is we do have the ability to cut a lot of process, and in fact, we can cut a process with grand jury return dates that will be when we anticipate the grand jury are sitting. We have reached out to our partners at a variety of different private institutions, and I can tell you that in the course of those investigations, they have been very helpful in moving information to us quickly. So we are able to obtain and investigate. The same is true for court orders. We are able to obtain those as well. The court has been very good at setting up remote processes to allow us to continue these investigations. So the investigations are proceeding very quickly, and we have been able to undertake substantial investigative steps even in the absence of the normal court functioning that we tend to have. In terms of criminal charges, we continue to be able to bring criminal charges. As you alluded to earlier, we always have available the potential to charge by criminal complaint. And if necessary, we would be able to ensure that our criminal charges are able to comply with all relevant United States law. So we have taken a number of steps to ensure that in spite of the need for remote access and the lack of regular court functioning in our district, we are able to very aggressively pursue these matters and have been successfully able to investigate at this point and anticipate we will be able to charge as well.
So I'd just say hi to Stuart Berman first. Good to hear from you. I feel like I'm in Greenbelt getting grilled. But I would note also that the courts have been receptive to what we need. And I know there's been a regular conversation between both the Public Defender's Office, of course, and representatives of the Defense Bar, but as well as our first assistant, who has been in contact with the courts, letting them know the situation on the ground. And we have been able, Aaron and I, from our home offices, have been able to attack this fraud and to attempt to find it. I've been heartened recently when Aaron and I have been on phone calls with I won't name them, but a number of different, say, service providers or other internet providers who have services that are being abused for the purposes of fraud. When we've gotten on the phone with these folks, they are just as tuned to this as we are. They have set up people to deal with these frauds. In some instances, they have been quicker than we have been in getting things shut down. So there is a great deal of focus on this issue, which makes me feel good, and I hope it continues so that people can remain vigilant. And I'll leave it at that.
And one more thing, Stuart, just on the charges, because I know that could be a particular area of concern to people. We are also prepared to proceed to have hearings on complaints if we needed to. So, I know, as you know, it's an unusual thing to do in our district. Usually we supersede on an indictment and we don't have any sort of opportunity to have the complaint and the complainant examined. But if we need to, in order to proceed as effectively and quickly as possible, we are prepared to proceed by complaint as well here and make sure that the cases get charged.
We've all received training on preliminary hearings, retraining, so we are ready to go when necessary.
And it looks like there's another question here. It says, are you prosecuting medical device sales that may not meet FDA standards, such as fake N95 face masks? I think, Aaron, you had talked about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. The simple answer is yes. We are interested in individuals that are holding themselves out, marketing product that they claim may meet standards that does not, or other fraudulent materials. So if you do come across that, we want to know about it. We are interested in it. And if people are making claims that violate the Food and Drug Act, that violate the Consumer Products Act, or constitute wire fraud or mail fraud, we are going to prosecute that. So fake masks that claim to be FDA or other meet certain approvals that do not, we would like to know about those cases, and we are interested in pursuing them aggressively.
So hand in hand with the criminal tools that we've talked about, there's also a civil anti-fraud injunction statute, Section 1345, which empowers the Attorney General to bring a civil action in federal court to enjoin a defendant from violating the different statutes that we talked about, or some of those statutes, the mail and wire fraud statutes, among others. And it authorizes injunctions against ongoing or likely to reoccur criminal acts, and it can also be used to freeze assets that are tainted by fraud. And so the benefit of the preliminary injunction statute is that there's a lower burden than in a criminal case. The government need only demonstrate a reasonable suspicion that a violation is occurring or is likely to occur. And the legislative history of that act provides that Congress wanted to ensure that people would not be continued or would not continue to be victimized by fraud schemes while the government was readying a case for criminal prosecution. We can go to the next slide. And here is an example of the AUSA in the Western District of Texas and the Consumer Protection Branch at the department used this section to first get a temporary restraining order and then a preliminary injunction to shut down a website called coronavirusmedicalkit.com. And the website claimed that the World Health Organization was giving away free vaccine kits and that people who visited the website could order the kit, and all they'd have to do is pay $4.95 for shipping. And of course, as people paid the shipping fee for these non-existent kits, they were also providing their credit card information and their other personal information to these fraudsters in the process. So this works under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. The AUSA and the department obtained a temporary restraining order, and then 10 days later that was followed by a preliminary injunction, which again enables that criminal investigation to proceed while preventing this website from staying up and causing further harm to people. And the order granting the preliminary injunction in that case prohibited the defendants from operating any website, not just the coronavirusmedicalkit.com, but any website that promotes or purports to allow consumers to order a vaccine related to COVID-19. And also there are provisions there to prevent the destruction of evidence. So that is the Civil Anti-Fraud Injunction Act. We can go next to our resource slides.
So I want to take just a few minutes to point out some of these slides. I think Evelyn referred to them earlier, that these are places that you can refer your clients to for up-to-date information. And if someone is curious about whether or not a certain product is approved as a vaccine or a cure, of course, there are none at this point in time, you can refer them to official websites ending in .gov that can give them that information. I might give a particular plug for the Federal Trade Commission's website. I was on there just a couple days ago fishing around, and it is particularly helpful and contains a great deal of information, right down to they've got audio files of frauds that are ongoing frauds that people have recorded and sent in and are posted up on the website. I thought about trying to embed some of them into this presentation and then realized my skills in technology likely wouldn't have allowed me to do that properly. And again, clipping to the next slide, we again have our referral information down there at the bottom for the email address that we've set up, which we're happy to review anything that comes in there, as well as the Elder Abuse Fraud Hotline and the National Center for Disaster Fraud. If you happen to refer things to multiple different agencies, different email addresses, we'll sort them out. We've been getting referrals from the AG's office, from the National Center, from the Price Gouging Task Force. I've been heartened by the amount of coordination and communication that's been going on at this point in time. A number of people who understand that this is a big deal and understand that this is a danger out there in addition to the health risks that have been out there. I will note that we thought this was going to be an hour-long presentation, so we prepared this to be an hour. I guess we have 40 minutes to go if you guys want to cover questions. I'll say on a personal note, I'd like to say I appreciate the Maryland State Bar giving me an opportunity to put on a suit jacket and talk to adults rather than children for a little while. But if anybody has any other questions, we're happy to answer them.
One thing that didn't come up during the presentation, I don't think, that may be worth noting, and Sean and Aaron, this is really a question for you. If folks are reporting these types of scams and frauds to local law enforcement, to their local police department, is there any detriment to that versus using the resources that we've provided here, the Elder Fraud Hotline, the National Center for Disaster Fraud, or the resource that you have set up through our office?
See, Aaron was off mute. I don't know if you wanted to take that, or if you want me to take that, Aaron.
Go for it, Sean.
First things first is, I think reporting the crime is the most important thing. I don't think it's a problem to report the crime to local law enforcement at all. I know, in fact, there are we have task force designated local law enforcement who are working on task forces with federal law enforcement that are actually part of our team at this point in time in investigating COVID fraud. So hopefully all of that would get to us. That said, if what they're encountering is an internet-based fraud, it is likely not local. I mean, Aaron and I have encountered already frauds that appear very local and very small in scale, either on Craigslist or other social media, that in fact are international frauds, and they're being conducted from foreign countries. And by the time the victim realizes that this is not somebody living around the corner from them, it's somebody who lives in another country across the ocean, their money's gone. So they should think big, but I like to believe that we'd be on top of all of those complaints. All right, do we have any other questions at this point in time? All right, I don't see anybody, so I guess I'll just say thank you very much for taking the time to watch this. Reach out to us if you see something, say something, and thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. This is Andrea Terry with the Maryland State Bar Association. I'd really like to thank the Assistant U.S. Attorneys for the District of Maryland who were your presenters today, Evelyn Cusson, Aaron Zielinski, and Sean Delaney, for taking the time to put this presentation together. I thought the information was just super and of great use to lawyers who are going to be asked in now and in coming months to help their clients who might have fallen for some of these scams that were discussed this morning. But also, I think this is great information for the public. And if any of our viewers today had colleagues who were interested but couldn't join us for the live presentation this morning, this has been recorded and will be available on the MSBA.org website on our COVID-19 resources page. And please feel free to pass that information along. Thank you for joining us, and everybody take care.
Stay safe.
Take care.